My guest today has spent a lifetime thinking about what makes a city accessible. Richard Kuppusamy is an architect and disability rights campaigner. In his job, he is pushing boundaries by driving the development and adoption of digital engineering in the development and construction industry. He also has spina bifida, a congenital spinal condition which he has used to develop and inform his passion and advocacy for inclusive urban design and inclusive society in his native Singapore and beyond. So what is a truly accessible city? And how far off are we from achieving one?
You're listening to Smarter Cities, discussions on urban life and how it's changing around us, with Jason D'Souza.
Richard Kuppusamy, welcome to Smarter Cities.
Thanks very much, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's actually been almost a year and a half since you and I were together in Singapore, and you took us to that absolutely unbelievable hawker center. And I can't believe that it's been that long, and the amount of things that have gone on since then. I think when I was in Singapore with you, no one knew of this concept of a pandemic locking everybody into their countries. How are you, and how are things in Singapore?
Yeah, no, it's been. I can't actually recall that it's been a year and a half. It feels like more in some ways and less in others. It kind of depends, right? I think a lot of us wrote off 2020 as if it never really happened. It's one of those years we want to forget. But things are. I hate the term, but we are reaching a level of new normality. Everyone's wearing masks, going out and about, but the difference is at least people are going out and about. So city's kind of buzzing. There are people out shopping, driving around, and from the ghost town of 2020 to it's a real city again.
I was joking with one of our mutual colleagues. He wears his mask when he's not wearing it in the pocket of his shirt, such that it looks like a pocket square. And so I thought that maybe the mask had become a new pocket square mask fashion accessory. But he didn't find it quite as amusing as I did. But nonetheless, look, a lot to talk about. I mean, the context for this, of course, is I heard you speak at the Lendlease Asia conference, which is a company we're both proud to work for. It was an inspirational speech, and you've got such an interesting background that I thought it was really important that on a podcast about urban life and how it's changing around us, a perspective like yours was really important. So there's a lot I want to talk to you about what an accessible city is. But before I get into it, tell us about yourself. How did you get into doing what you're doing? And please do tell us a little bit about sort of the challenges you faced in becoming who you are.
So it's an interesting one, right? Because in the context of this podcast, you can't make very many assumptions about me because you can't see all of me. And that's been an interesting thing in the whole transformation of how we go about doing our work in the last year as well, right? So when you heard me speak at the Lendlease Asia conference, you could see me in person. And when you see me in person, and what I'm getting used to kind of describing who I am, because sometimes my audience has a visual impairment, and sometimes my audience might be deaf. So how do I describe myself? So I'm an architect by training, by profession. I sound like an American, but actually I'm Singaporean. I have a Anglo-Saxon first name, an Indian surname, a Chinese middle name. It says in my passport that I'm Indian by race, but I look Chinese. So, these are all very, very confusing factors in terms of how do you describe who I am, where I come from. The elephant in the room that is not in this particular room because you can't see me is that I'm actually disabled. I'm a wheelchair user. I have a permanent or a congenital disability. I would not say that it necessarily defines me. I guess it's one of those things that causes me to try and redefine myself constantly so that it does not define me. So disability is not, the way I see it is it's not my limitation.
Well, I always describe you as someone who supposedly has a disability.
Yeah, that's right. So, and that's the thing, right? The challenge is to work out how to get around it, how to how to hack the medical or physical condition that you're in and solve the problem, right? And
would you mind sharing a bit about what the condition is? Like, what does it, what is it, and how does it limit you or not limit you, as the case might be?
so I have spina bifida, of which there are degrees of it which can be very severe or not very severe, and I guess I'm kind of in the middle somewhere. It's a congenital disability where your spinal cord doesn't grow to attach, to connect up.
So you've had this since
So
childhood.
I've had this since birth, and the impact is that I'm paralyzed, semi-paralyzed, waist down, and I sit in a wheelchair today. It's been one of those things where I've kind of known about my condition since childhood, in that it was explained to me, what the issues would be and what the challenges in life could be like, and that was kind of very clear from the outset. So I've always lived with a lot of clarity and comfort around what my context is, and then just worked on not letting it be a barrier to what I want to do.
What does getting used to it mean? What does not letting it be a barrier mean? Is it a mental mindset that you've had to take in your early years? Is it something you've struggled with? Is it something you've had to find new ways of getting around as you use? Like, I'm just having no understanding at all of what you go through day to day. I'm sort of interested in how you are such an amazingly positive and effective person in the way you approach life. And I think a lot of the audience are interested in that. Right.
So I guess it can manifest itself in a couple of different ways, right? So you have your good days and your bad days. And in your good days, you have a very positive mindset about how you can be constructive, and how your disability is not preventing you from achieving what you want to achieve in life. And then you have your bad days where the barriers that we have in our world, which are, from an architect's perspective, I look at it and go, these are physical things. This is infrastructure. It's cities. It's the, transport. It's how we get in and out of buildings can be a barrier. And then it can be people. It's society. It's how we treat each other, right? At the end of the day, the more we respect each other, the easier relationships and the way things work can be. And so you face, I'll face an element of discrimination. And so that is a barrier that's probably harder to overcome than the infrastructure ones. And so those are my bad days, is when I dwell on those things. I've done a lot of reflection over the last sort of couple of years, kind of just allowing my disability to be part of my work in terms of the way, shaping what I think and what I want to do. So as an architect, getting into the profession, I always applied an extra set of rules to things, to say I won't ever design anything that I can't get into or out of safely. Right, and it was an extra barrier in architecture school, where people said, no, you don't need to. You can ignore the building regulations when you're a student. You can just do crazy things and just design and be creative. And I went, yeah, you can be creative, but the real world has building regulations and their constraints, and you have to understand how people use buildings, and some of those people have disabilities. So I spent a lot of time trying to study and understand that and apply that myself, because I thought that was a guiding principle that was an absolute necessity. It's a non-negotiable for me. And now I carry that into some voluntary work that I do. So I'm the president of the Disabled People's Association in Singapore, which is an advocacy group where we advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. And one of those big focus areas has been around the right to access employment and education. And you'd have thought that would be very, very straightforward, right? That's, again, one of those where common sense, you go, absolutely. But the reality is quite a lot of disabled people don't get that opportunity to an education or to employment, simply because they can't get out of their home. They can't get transport to university or to school. They can't get into the building, or they get into the place of work and then they find out there's no wheelchair accessible toilet. So how can they do a full day's work, right? So it's things that we take for granted as sort of quality of life, simple things, can become impossible things or barriers to people with disabilities. And so I've looked at that and I've gone, statistically, when you look at this in the context of Singapore, I can't remember the percentage now, but it works out to be, I think it's roughly around like 4 or 5% of disabled people are actually or make up the workforce. It's less than 1%. It's 0.5% of disabled people have employment in Singapore.
Wow.
Right, which makes up only 8,600 people overall. Whereas statistically, when you look at Australia, 46% of disabled people are employed.
There's been a big policy drive here to ensure, employment of anybody who has a capacity to work, and the whole job system here, which is something I spent a bit of time on early in my career, focuses on capacity to work and allowing people to get into the work. It's not perfect by any means, and some people view it as a way of reducing welfare payments as opposed to work. But I actually don't agree with that. I think everybody needs the opportunity to work if they can.
That's right, and actually when you talk to people with disabilities, they're not looking for the handout. They're looking for employment because they actually want to make a positive contribution, right? They want to pay their own way, right? Do their own heavy lifting, right? Quite often we forget that aspect of it, right? I think it's in human nature actually that people want to make that contribution. Yeah. Right? It's
a purpose question, isn't it? Like, it's funny, on this podcast we've had a lot of discussion around work, unsurprisingly, and what the purpose of work is. So you know our mutual colleague Kieran Hennessy, who's a futurist, and we keep talking about this idea of what happens if technology replaces every job and we end up on some form of universal basic income. Is there what happens to purpose? There's an argument that everybody will become artists or musicians or will go and invent something amazing. And the other argument is that, we'll end up in a form of social decay because people no longer have purpose. And so it's very interesting to hear you say that the sort of workforce participation question is important in every cohort of society, not just one. And the other reflection I had when we were thinking about this and talking about this was the concept of accessibility. We've talked about in a context of somebody with a disability, whether it be a physical one or visual or whatever. But I started to wonder about what a definition might be if you extended it to social accessibility, educational accessibility. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a tough one, right? So I think this one, it's like I go back to this thoughts around diversity, right? We always talk about diversity primarily from the idea of gender. And then we go after, and then, diversity in the workplace is primarily driven by gender. And then it's maybe driven by race, right? And we almost never talk about diversity by disability, right? It's
just, now that you mention it, I don't think I've ever heard it mentioned.
We make an assumption about it, but we never really think about it. We don't put a KPI against it, so it's like, how do we, if we applied diversity from a much broader perspective, how would you change your thinking around access to employment, access to an education, access to social life, right? When we talk about accessibility from a physical perspective, we think about, it's easy to go, well, okay, I'm thinking about ramps and lifts and how I get into it, how wide is the doorway. But when you go access to social life, it starts to go, I should have the right and the means to hang out where I want, go to the cinema with friends, sit next to people that I want to sit next to, not, walk through the door alongside them, not go, there's an accessible entrance around the corner, right? And, access to services, in a millennial generation, we kind of, we're really happy to, we want more services, right? We want outcomes. We want to use applications. We're happy to consume a lot of things that we would have in a traditional world in a very different way, right? For example, e-commerce has probably completely changed the way a lot of people with disabilities interact with retail. Because where before access to that aspect of social life, going to the mall to shop, was very much about transport and physical access, and also facing discrimination in that interaction of customer service, right? So I'll go into a shoe shop and people will not actually talk to me. People will talk to my partner instead.
Oh, really? Really?
Even though I'm the buyer, right? It's men's shoes and I'm the buyer. And they'll make an assumption, well, the guy in the wheelchair is probably not going to need a pair of shoes, or, is incapable of having the interaction. So, which is...
How do you address that, though? If somebody is talking to your partner about men's shoes with her obvious partner next to her, how do you deal with that? Do you say, "Hi, excuse me, actually, I'm the customer," or what do you do?
Sometimes you need to do that, right? So I guess it's that's the where you have to decide, is it a good day or a bad day? Do you want to turn that interaction into an opportunity for advocacy and an argument for civil rights, which believe me, I have done that more often than not. I have to say that's probably my angle. In my older age, I think I might have calmed those moments down a little bit more.
Haven't we all? Goodness.
So there are different approaches to it, right? But I think you look at where we are today, and the pervasiveness of technologies means that you can now consume a lot of things that from an aspect of disability and access that you could not reach before. You find it easier to reach now. Right? Because you don't necessarily have to interact with the physical infrastructure or people, because you can just do it online.
I was thinking about that when you were speaking earlier about how people can't necessarily see you in your chair. So all of a sudden, in this world, a Microsoft Teams world or a Zoom world or whatever world, disability doesn't actually exist, because
Absolutely.
We're all stuck on virtual computers and virtual worlds. In fact, international boundaries don't really exist anymore.
Yep.
I was on a Teams chat earlier with a colleague of mine in Malaysia who was talking to me about something we needed to do, and the legal representative that was working, or legal lawyer working on our thing, was in Singapore, and I was in Sydney, sitting in that strategy thing you and I were both in, also represented on Teams, and the work was kind of going on and happening, and the time difference is actually assisting me because they're still working while we're heading into evening times. So it's a fascinating time that we're kind of going into, where the technology has sort of erased boundaries of country. It's erased boundaries of how teams form, and it's also erased, by what you're saying, any sign of difference between people. You don't necessarily know I'm a person of Indian extraction unless I turn my camera on. Like, I have a similar story where I'm a kid from Hong Kong, educated in a British school of Indian extraction, who now lives in Australia, married an Australian. That is a sort of child of the world, I suppose, scenario. I have a Christian name, despite the fact that I'm Indian. I'm a minority in India, being Catholic, as opposed to a majority Hindu. So this country. So it's a fascinating world we're sort of moving into. But do you sense then that the discrimination or the exclusion, I think perhaps is a better word, of people with a disability is now potentially being erased by technology, or is that a step too far?
I wouldn't say it's being erased. I think the technology has been a good enabler of better accessibility and more inclusion, right? So it's certainly been the case that where we've seen a lot more people, I guess, as this kind of last year has shown us, is that a lot of people who made an assumption that work had to be in the workplace, right, had to be in the office. We've largely proven for most businesses that that's not true, right? In the business that we work in, with over 10,000 employees globally, it did not shut its doors, right? It kept on going. There was never a day when we stopped work. In fact, if anything, the work actually increased once people learned, how to do a video call instead of all trying to schedule in a physical room to fit ourselves in. It democratized a lot of things that we did, because now people who were excluded from meetings before because you can't fit more than 8 people in the room that we booked, it's now, well, okay, if the rest of the team wants to join in and listen in for context, they can, and they can get direct access to information, where before you might say, maybe I don't bring my graduates to this call, to this particular meeting, because there's not enough space for everyone. So it's democratized information and access in that way. People with disabilities now don't need to get into the workplace, and there's no more argument over, we can't make that happen, because we know that the video calls, the Teams calls can be made to work. Sure, that deals with people with physical disabilities. There are still a group of people with different disabilities that don't fit in so easily to a Zoom or a Teams call fixing access for them. But certainly it's been an enabler for a large group of people. And I would say that there's probably a very large group of people who I've worked with in the last 1 year who probably still don't know that I have a disability. Because
they've only ever seen you virtually.
They've only ever seen me through a Teams call. Yeah. And I don't tell them, and I don't intend to.
Well, there's no need for you to, right? I mean, there's no need
to, but it's always a very interesting experience when you do meet them in reality. and that did, sort of, oh, hi. That did happen in 2019 when I was last in Sydney. I met someone in Lendlease who we had interacted with many, many times by email and online calls for a year. And then I rocked up in the office, and they did not know. They didn't know what to. They weren't who I am, and who they were meeting was not who they expected in real life, which was
did it change
always
their
amusing.
behavior towards you, though? It wouldn't have changed their behavior towards you, though, wouldn't it? It would just be I wasn't expecting.
No, it's not. Yeah, it generally tends to be a bit of a shock value for the first couple of minutes, and then we move on with things.
Which I suspect, knowing you quite enjoy. But anyway, that side. Look, I mean, it's a really interesting perspective and space you have. I do love your positivity about how you approach educating people and us and the industry and the business around some of the things we need to do to make our developments better, to make our architectural thinking better. I loved at the conference when you put that photograph up of your time in Scotland, I think it was, with the hill that you had to go up in your wheelchair to get to university. I mean, these are the sorts of things. And again, you did it with such a humorous approach that it actually made your story accessible to others, to use this term, accessibility. So it's an amazing story. But I think that's a good segue then into a more broad discussion around development. And one of the things you and I have talked about a lot is Asia and Singapore, and you being a proud, diverse Singaporean. I'm fascinated by the Singaporean story. It is just an amazing city. I'm in the middle of Lee Kuan Yew's story at the moment. I'm reading his book, a beautifully written book. And to think of the journey that Singaporeans have gone through to become the people you are today. What is your reflection on Singapore? You're a person who's traveled a lot. You work with a lot of international businesses. You're proud of your country. What is your reflection of Singapore today in terms of where it is, and where do you think it's going?
This could be a very dangerous question. So
I didn't say this was going to be an easy discussion, Richard.
I think Singapore's an interesting country insofar as it's gotten to a place that you would not have imagined, and done so in far faster than anyone could do, right? So it's in, I guess it's a very unique city in terms of its unprecedented kind of growth, its position as a first world country in Southeast Asia. you look at the infrastructure here, it is miles apart from the likes of, Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok. And it's also very gentrified. It's very controlled. It's very manicured, right? And that is part of the reason of how it got to where it is today, right? So a lot of what we see on the surface and we go, what a fantastic city, look at what it's achieved. There's another part of it that we don't look at, that we don't talk about, right? Some of that's to do with the control of government and government policy, of which, there are more people, there are maybe more dissenting voices. It's not like there's a revolution going to happen or anything, but there are more voices of dissent, and it's more reasonable now to expect that than was permitted in the past.
Of course, the government always claims there has always been an ability to dissent. In my hometown, Hong Kong, perhaps is a bit of a different case in point right now than perhaps Singapore is. But I get your point. That it's not always been an easy thing to do to have dissent in Singapore. Is that what you're saying?
To have the discourse, the discussion, not always been easy, but also that because of that, we've kind of ignored that there are, when you look at Singapore and you go, it's an affluent city. There are a lot of expensive cars, a huge population of multimillionaires living here in a very small plot of land. But on the flip side of that, we kind of ignore the fact that there are still homeless people. There are still disabled people. You don't see them around town, but there are, and we're not having a lot of social discourse around the parts of Singapore that aren't successful. We don't see it. We don't talk about it. We just it's just not visible, right? So that I guess is the darker part of Singapore that I would like to see more people think about it a little bit.
But I would argue as a counterpoint that is the case for a lot of major first world cities, is that these sort of social problems or social issues or undercurrents are often sort of just swept under the carpet. I would argue that's probably the case for Sydney, right? You don't, not probably is the case for Sydney. When you're in the CBD, you don't tend to see some of the social problems that exist in our country. I would argue the same is the case in the UK. It used to be the case in parts of America, but I think, places like San Francisco, for example, have taken the veil off, and you can see in stark view the price of not having a proper safety net in the United States.
Yeah.
As the sort of gap between haves and has-nots has increased. And I think, if anything, the pandemic has increased that gap between the haves and has-nots. So ironically enough, government stimulus has made the wealthier wealthier, and the not so wealthy less wealthy. And I think that's an ongoing social problem in the West. And I'm not sure how that affects Singapore, but it certainly is in the West. There's definitely a problem.
Again, it's like that's one of the ones that you don't see in Singapore. That rich-poor divide, we don't see it. It's here. It's definitely here, but it's not anywhere near as evident. And we live in a bubble in Singapore where things look really rosy here, generally speaking, right? You can't complain too much about living in a country where there is only 1 to 0 community cases of COVID.
Yes,
on a daily basis.
Well, trust me, in Australia, we seem to feel like that too. One of our states shut down for 3 days because there was one case. Went into a full lockdown for one case. So I know how you feel.
So there is a lot to be thankful for, but that doesn't mean that you get complacent about what you've got, and also the means by which you create it, and the amount of social freedom that you have to give up in order to attain what Singapore has attained. There is an element of sacrifice in here that people have made.
I can understand that because of the journey that Singaporeans have had to take to get to where they are. I wanted to focus on one thing, though, because you're right about the fact that there were always trade-offs and sacrifices. There are always, in every city, I would argue, some undercurrents and social problems that exist that may not necessarily get the right attention. But I think some of the policies that the government and the country put into place have been visionary. And I remember you teaching me when we were together about the Housing Development Board, its policy in the early years about saying every Singaporean is going to have a house. Everyone. That, I might get these numbers wrong, but is it 80% of people live in some form of Housing Development Board property?
Yeah, it's about 80% of people live in public housing, right? And I use the term very carefully, public housing. It's not social housing.
So what is public housing in a Singaporean context?
So public housing in a Singaporean context is in and around how we provide a roof over everyone's head, such that everyone who's a citizen has the right to put a roof over their head, right? And that is own the property. Technically, the properties are leasehold, so they're not. You don't really own them, but they are. Yeah. But they're leaseholds over a time frame that is 99 years from the time when the property is completed as a physical building. So it's more than a lifetime for most people. It is, I guess, one of the one if maybe the only right that you actually have as a Singaporean is that you have the ability to buy one of these units. You can only have one.
But you can buy property privately if you want to.
You can buy property privately, but in terms of buying what is government subsidized public housing, that is somewhat price controlled through policy making, you're allowed one. And it's for you to live in, not for you to buy as an investment property. So it's quite an interesting model. I would advocate that it is the best model of public housing anywhere in the world.
I would agree.
And certainly one that Singapore should seek to export, right, to other countries. There's a really interesting mechanism around how they're designed, how they're procured in order to keep it cost effective, right, to build them, right, and maintain them, and it means that there is somewhat affordable housing in Singapore.
Well,
right.
I mean, I think it's a visionary policy, and in fact, I will be more forthright in saying in most Western countries, including Australia, we have a social housing, public housing shortage. We don't have in this country the example that you put forward of the right to buy a publicly subsidized house. That doesn't exist. There is most of the housing, we have a housing shortage for those who are less well off at the moment, particularly those in social housing, which of course is defined by as people who are either marginally employed or unemployed and require a place to live. And so as a consequence of that, public housing debate has been this sort of mishmash of policy solutions, whereas I think, the Singaporean view was, and taken very, very early on in the formation of Singapore, everybody will have a roof over their heads. They have the right to one house that will be built with public funding. The leasehold element of it means that there will be continued transfer of property. And as a consequence of that, the wealth effect is automatically raised. And while there may well be a wealth gap in Singapore, and I don't know the number, but I imagine that it's probably less than what you might see in, say, the United States, which is clearly suffering from a widening wealth gap. Let's just go back to it for a second. So you mentioned the policy itself drives a form of design, procurement behavior, and sort of relationship in a city. And I remember when we were talking about it and you were teaching me about it, the design of a particular housing development board precinct is quite interesting, isn't it? It's sort of a series of buildings, there are different typologies, there is a market in the middle of it, there's food in the middle of it, it's a very kind of mixed use experience. Can you tell us a bit about that? How did the ethos form?
This is the earliest days of urban design in Singapore, right? About how do you build a city? How do you build a modern city? Because where we got to in that period of time in the 60s when Singapore kind of got its independence from the British was this time of you need to build multiracial social cohesion, You've got to build townships and communities, and it's not as simple as just knocking up a bunch of flats for people to live in, which is pretty much what happened in the UK, right? Is that
post-war.
Post-war social housing was just about jamming in lots of people into tall buildings, and you were taking people who were used to living in 4-story tenements, low-rise buildings that you knew all your neighbors, right? And you could see each other and you could protect each other in a community, and then you slap them up in a concrete high-rise tower.
Yeah, in a square shape with these sort of things that join them, and it ended up being dangerous to live in them.
Right, and very disconnected from the ground plane, and that's not the formula for what is placemaking, right? And we talk about that a lot in our day-to-day work, right? Is placemaking. So Singapore set up both the Housing Development Board, which is a statutory body of the government to drive public housing, but they also set up the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is the planning authority. So it's not just this is. Maybe it's simpler because it's Singapore and the size of Singapore. It's like it's a city, it's a country, right? So it's all in one. But it means that there is a national policy and not just a state or city policy around how these things come together. And that urban planning there was a real strength in urban planning design to go, this is the formula that it takes to build a township from scratch, right? And that you don't just build the housing, but you've got to build that ground plane. You've got to provide, the amenities, the swimming pool, the playground, the school, the place to eat, the market.
I'm dreaming of that food, by the way. We're having this conversation. But nonetheless, I digress. So you were saying, yes.
So providing those amenities was absolutely critical, right? And then there's also this element of you've got to democratize the housing as well, right? So you can't have one generation or one person owning a unit in one block complaining that the other guys got more of something, because at the end of the day you all paid the same amount of money, right? Or you're all how can the government give one guy more than the other just because of sheer luck of postcode lottery? So there is a design template, and there is a conscious effort to try and make it fair game, right? And because it's public housing, it also means that all of that public space between the buildings and now on top of the buildings, because we're now finding Sky Garden,
Tanjong Pagar has that beautiful HDB building and that amazing Sky Garden.
And it's democratized to say that because it's public housing, anyone in the country can go there. It's not a private condominium where you go only if you're a resident can you access these parks and these amenity spaces, and it's not walled in, right? So there's no fence around it. So public housing is made for the people, and the people is not just the people who live in the building. It's for anyone in the country to use. So these are some of the really core principles that have been established that allow us to do this, right?
That to me is really interesting in terms of the accessibility of space. In fact, ironically enough, that's sort of a principle here in Australia we're adopting more and more, where the foreshores used to be privatized, like we've seen in some countries, and they're not now. In fact, here where we're at Barangaroo here in Sydney, we've just opened the foreshore walk all the way around, all the way around the bays, and it is absolutely extraordinary. And the beauty of it is the fact that it's accessible. The fact that anybody can use it means you have a diversity of people, you have a diversity of experience, you have a diversity of color, and movement. And that's what makes a city work, I think. I think where you end up with exclusivity over places is where cities sort of begin to fail. And the other thing I wanted to reflect on a bit in the Singaporean context, Lee Kuan Yew talks a lot about this in his speeches and when he was around and in his book, is the fact that Singapore is a multiracial society, and that everybody, the race part was sort of made secondary by the fact that language was used as a unifying factor. So everybody got to have their secondary language, whether it be Malay or Hindi or whatever, or Hokkien. But English was the unifying language factor. And that's, again, something we probably take for granted in Australia. where the majority of people are English speaking. And in fact, his reflection on India being a place difficult to govern them because there are, some 50, 60, 70 languages. Do you believe that language is part of accessibility in a city?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's one of those things we don't dwell on because we kind of take it for granted a little bit until you go to a foreign country and you kind of find out that you can't you struggle to get around, right? So
I will, as an aside, I will say as a Hong Konger, Singaporeans always look down on our standard of English because our Hong Kong Chinese schools spoke with a Hong Kong Chinese accent, and Singaporeans were very quick to to be critical.
Oh, it's not good
language
here anymore. I probably get slammed for this, but the Singlish accent or Singlish has become a kind of more acceptable as it's become recognized, right? Yeah. As a almost like a dialect or and it's it's not easy. It's not easy to work it out either.
I just got told I had to say "la" a lot, and that'd be fine. But I honestly think, and jokes aside, that the policy there of making English a unifying factor of Singapore is probably what contributed a lot to its connectivity as a city.
Yeah, so that's an interesting foresight, by LKY at the time, right? Because you needed to be able to do business internationally. Singapore was never going to be successful on its own, and yes, have independence from the British, but you still want to be able to trade with them, and you want to be able to attract foreign companies into Singapore to work, to build their businesses here. And that wasn't going to happen if if language was a barrier to setting up, right?
And also welcoming people to Singapore. He was very keen on expatriates with skills coming in and working with Singapore being a financial hub. And those are all policies now that the countries like ours are trying to emulate, right? To an extent, what's Singapore doing? We should look at that, right? And in fact, it's a good opportunity to do a little bit of what we do on a day-to-day. So, you and I live in the digital business here at Lendlease, where we're doing some pretty interesting and cutting-edge work. And one of the things you're leading is how we can apply digital tools and digital technology to some of the development thinking we're doing in Singapore. And I was wondering if you might share a bit of that with us and how you've been driving us in Singapore and how you're helping us relate to the Singaporean government.
Yeah, so actually, I think digital is to an extent is another language. I'm finding that it's a very or digital engineering, the discipline. So I lead a team of people in Lendlease. It's a group of people who I would call practitioners of digital. They're the ones who use these tools to change the way we go about doing design and construction of buildings, do things smarter, not harder.
It's a great phrase, isn't it?
It is a great phrase.
And just to be clear, the tools we're talking about are a mix of digital twin and
using how do we use 3D models to help us understand design better rather than drawing two-dimensional drawings? How do we then drive the use of data to make decisions in the property lifecycle? Innovations around the use of drones and photogrammetry and laser scanning on construction sites. So there's a number of different things, like the technology in the delivery of projects of what we do, and the technology of what's inside the assets that we build inside of smarter buildings, autonomous buildings. So what we're finding is that the language of this is actually very universal, in that you can have this same conversation with a digital engineer, a practitioner in the UK or one in the US, and they get it. The techniques and the things that we're trying to achieve are actually universal. So Singapore set up an interesting incubator for us. It's a great place to build our products and our ideas and to execute, because it's a nice little, it's got a scale about it. It's not too big, definitely not small in terms of its ambition and what it can drive. And because of its scale and because of the level of government control, there is national policy that drives the digitalization of the construction industry, right? So there is government level backing for the kinds of ideas that we have around increasing productivity and certainty around the delivery of buildings, around transforming our built environment sector from a construction sector to being a more manufacturing aligned sector. How do we turn things into products that's repeatable, consistently, higher quality, use less labor, use labor that upskill our labor, right? So that we're using a different skill sets. You can have this as an idea, as a policy, is no different to, there are other cities in the world, other countries in the world that want the same things, but can't find a way to turn it into a government level driven agenda that everyone will jump on board, right? And work to row in the same direction. Singapore is very good at driving that. And that's why there's a good synergy between what we want to do in Lendlease and what Singapore wants to achieve at a national level.
And it's interesting you say it, because I've been saying for a while in an Australian context that, Lendlease as an Australian company has the advantage in being able to access some of the smarts of the different cities, different countries we work in. And we should be able to take that from one place and help other places emulate that. So in an Australian context, I've been saying to people here, look at what the Singaporean government is doing in trying to transform its development and construction industry. And yes, it's got some certain dynamics around it. It's got a large pipeline in the Housing Development Board. It's got a small land mass. It's got, all these different things. But it's not just about the money. It's not just about employment priority. It's not just about skills development or anything. It's actually about trying to transform the entire thought process around coming up with new precincts virtually, and then backing it up with a whole new supply chain reform and a whole new manufacturing reform. And the fact that we are now doing it in Singapore, and we've got more and more people joining the team there, is a sign to countries like ours in Australia here that we've got to actually do it too. Otherwise, we will be left behind, and our industry and our sector will be left behind. And I think that's what's so exciting in the property and infrastructure sector to see, because as many of our colleagues, including the digital CEO, says regularly, the construction sector and the development sector has really not been that technologically advanced when it comes to digital engineering. I love the concept of an autonomous building, for example, a building that tells you how it's feeling, what's broken, what isn't working, what it needs to do to improve, maybe new ideas on how to use space. This idea of a building is quite far-reaching, far-thinking, right? I love the idea, for example, of an automated supply chain where you can press a button, order all the parts you need from the suppliers you've already got pre-contracts with, and they all get delivered and the building gets assembled or disassembled and moved somewhere else pretty quickly. And what I've been reflecting on recently is in these COVID times where buildings and maybe potentially the use of buildings or use of precincts is changing. Imagine that. Imagine if you could just sort of reform very quickly the way your city works, or think about a new precinct that you want to build and get it done quickly because it was going to increase economic productivity. I think the world and the opportunity of this thinking is endless.
And that is actually one of those opportunities that we really need to harness, because if you think about it, the good, from a sustainability perspective, the good majority of the built environment already exists today. It's already here, right? We live in a lot of, I guess, what we call brownfield buildings. I dare call them dumb buildings.
Well, they are effectively, aren't they?
If you want to have a smart building, there must be a dumb building to compare it to.
That's right.
So we live with a lot of these, and we're not going to be knocking them down. It is unsustainable. The most sustainable thing that you can do is redevelop and repurpose what you've already got. Recycle, upcycle. And so, at what is it going to take to enable us to actually start looking at the built environment in that way, rather than looking at rebuilding everything, and I think that's going to be an interesting pivot as the technology evolves and starts to enable us to understand the opportunities better.
So if you can take a building that is a dumb building and somehow retrofit it with the right digital technology, digital infrastructure, is that possible? And I personally, I think it is, right? So you think about before, in the not so long ago olden days, there was blue cable absolutely everywhere, right? And that was your only means of connectivity, right?
Yeah, and now it's 5G.
Now we're asking the question whether Wi-Fi is even needed, right? 5G is going to come in. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, well, if you have 5G everywhere, does the infrastructure for 5G actually need to be owned by a carrier, or can it be owned by the developer? Like, I'm kind of the view that actually the developer would own everything.
That's one of the big things around the repurposing of old buildings. The biggest issue, I guess, is around the cost of doing so. Is it worth doing or not? And yes, there's the financial cost. There's also a sustainability cost of demolishing a lot of concrete buildings just to build another concrete building or a timber building, right? Instead, a lot of those barriers kind of disappear, I guess, with some of the technology that's coming up in terms of like 5G. So connectivity to make a smarter building, make a dumb building into a smart building without having to wire it all in. But the other part of it's also just the flexibility, right, of repurposing what we've already got. The fact that there may already be a concrete shell, but it's made for an industrial building. How do we turn that into something that could be housing? And at what point in time does the technology allow us to evaluate that opportunity and actually deliver it in a sustainable way? What's the method of, what are the opportunities in sustainable construction materials and methodology that lets us convert that industrial building into a different use case, into a different asset class?
And then how do you measure it, I think, is the other thing as well, right? Because we instinctively know that not demolishing something is sustainable. But in the world where we're all moving to net zero 2050 targets, it has to be measurable as well. And so that I think is really interesting. Of course, we've had a bit of experience in our day-to-day jobs of measurement of things, social impact, carbon impact, and investors are increasingly relying on those measurements to meet their own ESG targets or own investor targets, right? And so it's a fascinating world we're living in what used to be just don't you guys just build stuff? Well, actually, yeah, we do a lot more than that now. I mean, we create actual new productive parts of cities that are mixed use, that deal with a lot of the policy problems that we've talked about today. There's a whole sustainability challenge that the world is facing. Well, actually, this sector has a huge role to play in meeting those targets. We've talked a lot about mobility. If you don't have people who are mobile or accessible in the city you live in, your city will fail. I think there's a lot here in the way that the digital infrastructure that we're creating, that we're implementing, that we're inventing, that we're putting in places, of a much larger role than I think even we know it's going to play in how the cities of the future will work. We'll have to end soon. It's been such a fascinating conversation, as usual with you, if I might say. If I was to say to you two challenges that you think we're facing, as a world, as a country, or as just in our daily lives, what will those two things be?
I think we're dealing with, maybe it's too profound, but an erosion of humanity. You kind of have to take some time to reflect on a lot of the civil rights and social movements that we've seen in the last couple of years, the last couple of years, right? Between Black Lives Matter and Me Too movement and various other things, right, in the world. You just go, and I can talk about accessibility and have the fact that I have to be an advocate for accessibility, which you would take as common sense, and freedom from discrimination, right, to have equality in the world, tells me that there's a real there is still a need to put effort into being a society, right? So how do you
it's an incomplete project is what you're arguing.
It's a very incomplete project. It's in some places it's going backwards. It's not making positive forward progress, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that faces us. The other part of it, I guess, is sustainability, right? Is that how are we going to become accountable for and take responsibility for and become accountable within our generation, within our lifetime, around sustainability. So when I look at the work that we do, the built environment sector contributes to 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a very big role to play. And very frequently we set these targets. We set if we set a net zero carbon 2050 target, well, in 2050, I'm probably retired by then. I hope so.
My goodness.
Or, when we set targets like that, there are a lot of people who go, it'll no longer be my problem when we arrive at that date. So I can keep putting it off. It'll be someone else's problem to deal with, right? So I think it's been enlightening in the last year for when I look at Lendlease, for us to have established that we're going to achieve net zero carbon by 2025 for scope 1 and scope 2, because it deliberately moves that target into a range where you go, it's your problem to fix, right? So it's your problem to fix. It's my problem to fix. We all have something that's very, very tangible. Now it looks impossible sometimes when people do this, right? But that's why you do it. If it was easy, you wouldn't, right? If it was easy, you'd just leave it to someone else's to be someone else's problem. But we've set the challenge for ourselves. And it's one that we have to rise to as a company, as individuals, as an industry. Though we have a vested responsibility to do this now. So,
well, I think that's a fascinating and wonderful point to end. Richard Kuppusamy, thank you so much for coming on Smarter Cities.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Smarter Cities. Please do subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or LinkedIn. Leave us a rating, it always helps. And tell your friends about us on social media. Intro and outro music is by Bruno E. at Public Memory. We are produced by Social Titanium out of New York. Check him out at socialtitanium.co.